Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Dunn. We're talking about the algebra of functions today. In this screencast, we will learn how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide functions, and we'll learn how to find the domain of these functions that we're adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. So we're going to do this two ways. We're going to look at it algebraically, and we're going to look at it graphically. We're going to start with it algebraically. So for example, we're going to consider two functions, f of x and g of x. And what I want you to do is add, subtract, multiply, and divide these two functions. So this notation means f plus g of x, f minus g of x, f times g, and f divided by g. So let's start with the first one, f plus g of x. That notation, f plus g of x, means f of x plus g of x. I feel like that's pretty intuitive. If I wasn't even teaching you how to do this, that's probably what you would guess that means. So we're going to find the f function, the g function, and add them together. And going down the line, they're all like that. So f minus g is f of x minus g of x, f times g is f of x times g of x, and f divided by g is f of x divided by g of x. I feel like that's exactly what you would think. Now let's look at a specific example when we know the value of f of x and g of x. So for example, we have these two functions defined as x squared minus 5 and g of x is x plus 3. So we're going to go through and we're going to find f plus gf minus gf times g and f divided by g. So the first one, f plus g of x, is f of x plus g of x. Well, f of x is this x squared minus 5, and g of x is x plus 3. And we're going to add these together. So if we're adding like terms, we have x squared, we have x, and then negative 5 plus 3 is negative 2. So x squared plus x minus 2 is the answer. Okay, f minus g of x is next. So that's x squared minus 5 minus x plus 3. It's the same as what we did before, except there's a subtraction sign. Now, please remember, you got to distribute that negative sign. So it ends up being x squared minus 5 minus x minus 3. When we combine like terms, we get x squared minus x, and then negative 3 minus 3 is negative 8. Okay, f times g of x is next. So x squared minus 5 times x plus 3 is equal to x cubed plus 3x squared minus 5x minus 15. Remember to do FOIL there, first, outer, inner, last. And lastly, we have the division, x squared minus 5 divided by x plus 3. And that's all you do with that. There's nothing more to do. That's the answer. So what I want to do next is I want to talk about the domain of these functions. So the domain of f plus g of x and f minus g of x, f times g of x, and f divided by g of x. So remember, when we're finding the domain, we're trying to find those values that we cannot use because either we're taking the square root of something negative or it leads to a 0 in the denominator. So that's what we're looking for. So these functions are defined, well, first of all, f plus g of x is the domain is all real numbers because you can put any value for x in there. There's nothing that's going to make the denominator 0, and there's no square root. The only one where the domain is not all real numbers is for f divided by g of x, because you can't use the number negative 3. Negative 3 would make the denominator 0. So the function f divided by g of x is undefined at negative 3. Okay, now we've talked about these functions theoretically. We've talked about the domain of them. Now what I want you to do is use these functions to find specific function values. So what's the value of f plus g of 2? F minus g of 2, f times, and f divided by g. So just like you would expect, and like we said before, f plus g of 2 is equal to f of 2 plus g of 2. So basically you're plugging 2 into the f function, plugging 2 into the g function. So f of 2 is equal to -1, g of 2 is equal to 5, and when we add those together, we get 4. Okay, now pause the screencast and you see if you can find the other 3 functions. So find f minus g of 2, f times g of 2, and f divided by g of 2. Now check your answers. You can pause the screencast and see if you got the same answers. Remember, f minus g of 2 is going to be -1 minus 5, which is -6. F times g of 2 is f of 2 times g of 2, which is going to be -5. And f divided by g of 2 is going to be f of 2 divided by g of 2, which is -1/5. Did you get them right? Okay, so that's what you do algebraically. The last thing we're going to do is talk about this graphically. So here's the graph of f of x and g of x. What I want you to do is using that graph, find f plus g of 2 for these 2 functions. These are not the f and the g from the previous PowerPoint slides. But for this function, find f plus g of 2. To do that, you have to find f of 2 and g of 2. So using the function f of 2 is equal to -2, and g of 2 is equal to +1. And -2 plus 1 is -1. Okay? See if you can find f times g of 10. Well, that's going to be equal to f of 10 times g of 10. And we have a problem because f of 10 is defined, but g of 10 is not defined. So since g of 10 is undefined, you see, we only have the value or values for g up to 9. If we try to find g of 10, it's undefined there. And since g of 10 is undefined, f times g of 10 is undefined. Okay, so let's talk about domain for f of x and g of x and when we're looking at a graph. So we want to find the domain of f plus g, f minus g, and g divided by f. We'll do this one at a time. So first, let's find the domain of f plus g of x. Well, the domain of f is 2 to 11. So you'll see that the x values for f start at 2 and go to 11. The g values for x start at 1 and go to 9. So the domain of f plus g of x is going to be from 2 to 9. We can only find the values of f plus g when the x values are between 2 and 9. And that's 2 and 9 inclusive. Notice they're in brackets. All right, let's look at f minus g. F minus g is exactly the same. So for f, just like before, it goes 2 to 11, and g goes from 1 to 9. So the domain of f minus g is going to be 2 to 9. Now, g divided by f is going to be a little bit different. So once again, we know the domain of f is 2 to 11. We know the domain of g goes from 1 to 9. But remember, we can't use any values that make the denominator 0. Well, we need to know when is f equal to 0. Well, that's right here on the graph, right? So f is 0 when x is 3. So that means that in the domain, we can't use that value of 3. So the domain of g divided by f starts at 2 and ends at 3, and then starts back up at 3 and ends at 9. Notice the bracket on 2 because it's included, but a parenthesis on 3 because it is not. Okay, that's it. You've learned about adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing functions, and we've talked about the domain, both algebraically and graphically. In the next screencast, I'll talk about the difference quotient. All right, good luck. Email me with any questions.